If your pivot tables are starting to encroach upon each other, then it may be an option to move them. Moving a pivot table is fairly straightforward, and you may need to move a pivot table anyway should you wish to move it from one sheet to a new sheet, or from one sheet back to another sheet. Now if we take our employees multiple pivot file, you'll see that it has 4 pivot tables on the same sheet, which is the pivot sheet. And if any of these were to be refreshed and data to change, there is a good chance that these pivot tables would want to overlap, then they wouldn't be able to overlap, and then we would run into problems. So one option is to move them. Now if we want to move a pivot table, we simply click into the pivot table we would like to move. So we're in the pivot table, it doesn't have to be this top left cell, can be anywhere really. Then bring up the Pivot Table Tools Context Sensitive ribbon, onto the Analyze sub ribbon, and we have a little Actions option, and you'll see it has a little pop out of Move Pivot Table. When we choose Move Pivot Table, it then asks us where we'd like to move it to. Now we can simply choose a new worksheet. When we click OK, a brand new sheet is inserted and that pivot table is moved to that sheet. Let's just widen those columns. And it is physically moved because on the pivot sheet, the pivot table is no longer there. So that was an easy option. The other option is to move it within the same sheet. So we could take this one and move it to the right a little. So we do the same thing. We click in anywhere in the pivot table area, so anywhere around here, onto Bits ribbon, the Analyze sub ribbon, Actions and Move. And this time we'd just like to move it within the existing worksheet. So I'm going to move it from E3 to K3. Now notice how it's picked up both addresses. It will not happily handle that at all. So let's delete that and then click on K3. That way it picks up pivots, exclamation mark. So that's the name of this sheet, K3. OK, and the pivot table moves to K3. Totally intact, still doing exactly the same thing, leaving us a little bit more expansion room. And then lastly, we might want to move this particular pivot table. So selecting the last pivot table and Actions, Move Pivot Table, and we'll move it across here to the left. So that's A15. OK. So then these two have expansion room to the right, and this one can go right and down. Now if we wish to remove a pivot table from our sheet, then it's simply enough to select the pivot table and then delete. If I wanted to remove this one, I can click, highlight the pivot table. Now there are a couple of ways of highlighting the pivot table. One is to just drag your mouse across, as we've done there, or you can click in and do the keyboard shortcut Ctrl-A, and that will select the pivot table. Alternatively, we can use the Actions mini menu in the Analyze ribbon and select Entire Pivot Table. So we've got 3 ways of selecting the pivot table, but the whole pivot table must be selected so that when you press delete on the keyboard, the whole pivot table disappears. It's gone. So we could lose this one, click in. My favorite is to do Ctrl-A and then delete because that's 2 keyboard actions and your pivot table is gone. Alternatively, if your pivot table is the only thing on the sheet, as we have here in sheet 1, then we can simply delete the sheet. And that will delete the pivot table as well. Obviously, we're asked if we're sure in this case, because you cannot undo the deletion of a sheet, whereas we can undo the deletion of a pivot table. So if you inadvertently delete a pivot table, your undo will bring it back. So if we were to take our last pivot table, Ctrl-A to select, delete to get rid of, no confirmation because the undo will bring that back. So we've seen we can move pivot tables should they be starting to interact with each other, and we can also delete pivot tables.